We are back from the founding conference of the Revolutionary Communist International. If you look at our podcast feed, you'll see 2 episodes posting this week. This one and another one called How the Bolshevik Party Was Built. Both of these episodes were recorded at the founding conference by the American delegation comrades Antonio Balmer and John Peterson. We definitely recommend that comrades go to the link below with the playlist that includes all of the sessions from that week, not just from the American comrades, but from the other comrades from a bunch of different sections that did leadoffs at this event. But we edited these episodes. There's usually pauses for translations during these events because it's an international event and not everybody's native language is English. Those pauses have been cut out for this episode. Without further ado, let's get into John Peterson's leadoff on what is imperialism.
The question of imperialism, it really is a vast subject. And it really penetrates virtually every aspect of modern life. It's what lies behind the proxy war between US and Russian imperialism in Ukraine, behind Israel's genocidal slaughter in Gaza, and it's what's driving millions of people to become communists today. So it's essential that we have a really deep and nuanced understanding of it. It's not enough to know that it's the foreign policy continuation of capitalist domestic policy, which arises at a certain stage of capitalist development. And there's more to it than conquest, military conquest, and competing spheres of influence. It's the mortal enemy of the working class, and it's what the workers of the world and the RCI are going to bury in this century. So the purpose of this discussion isn't just to analyze it in the abstract, theoretically, but to understand our class enemy in order to overthrow it. Now, as we've been discussing this week, the relative stability of the post-war period, when US imperialism was counterbalanced by Russian Stalinism, is finished. Now, according to the risk analysts at Verisk Maplecroft, it's an analyst company, in 2024, this is their perspectives document, basically. In 2024, the global risk landscape will remain locked in a process of sweeping realignment that is amplifying a complex set of systemic risks that are increasingly transcending borders and sectors. Now, number 1 of their top 10 list of themes to watch this year is what they call geoeconomic fragmentation. Now, that's a fancy word for rising protectionism and for a reversal of global economic integration. Or as some people have called it, it's slowbalization. Anyway, and this is a process that has accelerated over the last decade. And it's having a very clear impact on foreign direct investment, which is part of the lifeblood of capitalist globalization. According to the World Bank, this process of unraveling encompasses different channels, including trade, capital, and migration flows. Now, by some estimates, FDI fell by 12% in 2022 and by another 7% in 2023, and it remains below pre-pandemic levels. And there have also been significant shifts in where this FDI is being sent. And the reason is simple. Capitalists invest to make money, not for fun. And if the risk is too high or the profits are too low, they'll look for safer or more profitable alternatives. So this question of the flow and export of capital and the weaponization of trade is essential if we want to understand imperialism. Because when most people think of imperialism, they think of war and missiles and aircraft carriers, and that's certainly part of it. But in the final analysis, as Marx explained, it's the economic relations that determine the main parameters of society. And although there's a dialectical interrelationship between many moving parts, it's the contradictions built into the capitalist economy that lie behind the rising instability, the class struggle, and the intensification of inter-imperialist rivalries. And as Lenin pointed out, it's through finance capital, not overt military might, that imperialism dominates most of the planet in the day in and day out of our lives. Now, military power is ultimately a function of economic power. It's also a question of the class balance of forces. Because as Lenin said, politics is a concentrated expression of economics. And I think we can add to that economics is a concentrated expression of the class struggle. And of course, foreign policy is an extension of domestic policy and vice versa. And just as individual capitalists are compelled on pain of extinction to expand their capital, every imperialist state does the same for its collective national capitalists on the world arena. And just as we see the rise, fall, and endless changing of places of the petty bourgeois and the big bourgeois, with some companies growing into juggernauts and other very well-known companies falling into ruin, there are imperialists, big and small, and there's a constant shifting in the balance of power between them. Now, sometimes this happens without too much disruption. Other times, it leads to all-out war. But the point is that in the epoch of imperialism, it's all about defending private property of the means of production and expanding the reach of capital by any means necessary, whether that's through alliances, treaties, embargoes, invasions, occupations, annexations. The human cost doesn't matter. And all serious imperialists understand this. This is what Lord Palmerston had in mind when he said, Lord Palmerston famously said, we have no eternal allies, and we have no perpetual enemies. Our interests are eternal and perpetual, and those interests it is our duty to follow. Now, during the U.S. occupation of Cuba at the beginning of the 20th century, the military governor, he saw the question of political stability on the island as a function of business confidence. As he wrote the Secretary of War, when money can be borrowed at a reasonable rate of interest, and when capital is willing to invest in the island, a condition of stability will have been reached. On the other side, you have a former U.S. Army general named Smedley Butler, who became an anti-war activist. And this was his take on his role while he was in the military. That I helped make Mexico safe for American oil interests in 1914. I brought light to the Dominican Republic for American sugar interests in 1916. I helped make Haiti and Cuba a decent place for the national city bank boys to collect revenues in. Now, as Marx explained, the executive of the modern state is but a committee for managing the common affairs of the whole bourgeoisie. And as Engels added, it's the bodies of armed men of the state, including the police and the military, who enforce those common affairs at home and abroad. And it's the defense of those interests that lies behind the brutality, the racism, the horror without end that fills us all with a burning hatred for capitalism. So to make sense of this world we live in, we have to start with a theoretical understanding of imperialism. And I think it's also useful to have some historical context for how we got to where we are today. So let's establish a baseline by briefly reviewing Lenin's understanding of the question. Now, his writings on war and imperialism really are essential reading for all Marxists. We have a new book on this question as well. But his main work on imperialism, which was written in 1916, was really a watershed for Marxists. And he counterposed modern capitalist imperialism to the imperialism of the ancient world. And although he emphasized that, no definition should be treated like a checklist, valid for all time, he did identify 5 key features for understanding what he called the highest stage of capitalism. First, you have the concentration of production and capital has developed to such a high degree that it has created monopolies which play a decisive role in economic life. Second is the merging of banking capital and industrial capital into finance capital, which leads to the emergence of a financial oligarchy with immense power over the economy, and it's fused closely with the state. Third is the rising importance of the export of capital as distinguished from the export of commodities. And this creates an international network of dependence on finance capital, which spreads its tentacles all over the world, especially through its banking system. So fourth is the formation of international monopolist capitalist associations, which share the world amongst themselves. And finally, you have the territorial division of the planet among the biggest capitalist powers, who all want spheres of influence, sources of raw materials, cheap labor, and markets to export commodities and capital. So Lenin's conclusion after this analysis was that the 20th century marks the turning point from the old capitalism to the new, from the domination of capital in general, to the domination of finance capital. Capitalism has been transformed into imperialism. But he added that imperialism is the eve of the social revolution of the proletariat. And that's why, despite this hellscape that humanity is passing through, the RCI is filled with revolutionary optimism for the future, because all of this is only preparing the objective conditions for the transition to a higher stage of human society. Now, not too long ago, we were supposed to believe that war was an abnormality. It was a disruption of normal, peaceful capitalism, a necessary evil when human rights and democracy were under threat. But far from the Pax Americana that we were promised after the fall of the Soviet Union, by at least one estimate, there are 110 armed conflicts raging around the world, from Congo to Sudan to Myanmar. Now, the prospect of an all-out world war is highly unlikely at the present time. This is due in part to the deterrent effect of nuclear weapons, but above all to the class balance of forces, which is overwhelmingly in favor of the working class, who have no interest in a repeat of World War I or World War II. But even small wars are absolutely disastrous for the people that are caught up in them. As of last year, more than 114 million people have been forcibly displaced worldwide as a result of crisis and war, the highest levels on record. So this new normality of war and displacement, it's really just a return to the old capitalist normality on a higher and even more devastating level. So who benefits from all this suffering? Well, arms manufacturing and exports is big business, and it's fused closely with the state. Now, when a country like the US gives weapons to another country, it's usually in the form of loans that can only be used to buy weapons from the country making the loan. And there are huge built-in profits for the private arms manufacturers. In 2023 alone, just one company, Lockheed Martin, raked in nearly $8.5 billion in profits, which is equivalent to the GDP of Togo, which is a country of nearly 9 million people. Now, the current US military budget is $877 billion. But in practice, over $2 trillion is allocated to the Department of Defense, which is nearly 15% of the US federal budget. Now, the US spends more than twice as much on its military as all other NATO members combined. And as the crisis of capitalism deepens and instability and tensions rise, there's a new arms race and a revival of militarism, including countries like Germany and Japan. So total global military expenditure in 2023 reached the record high of $2.44 trillion, which was a 6.8% increase from the year before. Now, all of this is a colossal waste of resources that could instead be used to improve the whole of humanity. As Ted Grant once put it, vast amounts of money are being squandered every year on arms expenditure, which under modern conditions is mainly the production of expensive scrap metal. Now, before we look at the relative decline of US imperialism, let's quickly review its meteoric rise. It started with the First American Revolution, which was the first successful war of colonial liberation against what was then the biggest imperialist power on the planet. And it established the US as the only real power on a vast continent that was rich in natural resources. In 1803, the US nearly doubled in size when it bought the Louisiana Territory from Napoleon. And in 1823, it issued the Monroe Doctrine, which rejected further colonization or intervention by European powers and effectively claimed the Western Hemisphere as its backyard. In 1846, it annexed Texas, the state of Texas, which had declared its independence from Mexico, which led to what many people called a wicked war with Mexico. And once the war was over, the United States bought half of Mexico for $15 million, which is a pretty good deal, considering that California alone has a GDP of $3 trillion, which is more than double the entire GDP of Mexico. Then came the Second American Revolution, Civil War, and this really laid the basis for the unfettered flourishing of capitalism and industrialization. From the expansive commercialization of agriculture, the establishment of a national banking system, a vast network of roads, railroads, ports, canals, and huge advances in military technology, which only intensified after the war, where you had the tragic abortion of Reconstruction in the South, aggressive westward expansion into lands that were still occupied by indigenous populations, and the purchase of Alaska from Russia in 1867. And this industrialization was heavily backed by state intervention, and the economy accelerated at previously unimaginable rates. In just 30 years, from 1860 to 1890, US GDP quintupled and went from about $12 billion to over $60 billion. By comparison, the GDP of the UK in 1890 was less than $11 billion. And I think that clearly illustrates the economic basis for the ascent of US imperialism and the eventual decline of British imperialism. Of course, a powerful working class was also forged, and there were many inspiring and heroic class battles, but the territorial limits of this expansion on the continent were eventually reached. And inevitably, the US wanted its own overseas colonies. Never mind that the Europeans had already carved everything up. Because as Lenin explained in his work on imperialism, just because the world has been divided doesn't mean it can't be redivided if the balance of forces changes. So in 1898, the hawks in the US administration, the pro-war wing, picked a fight with the decaying Spanish Empire. And after a few months of fighting, it had defeated Spain and taken possession of the Philippines, Guam, Cuba, and Puerto Rico. Now, before 1898, there were very few references in the media or in politicians' speeches to the word America. The country was referred to as United States. But after 1898, with all these new colonies, they started talking of a greater America or even imperial America. Now, Cuba formally gained its independence from the US in 1902, but as we know, it remained a de facto colony until 1959, many decades later. And even today, US has nearly 9,000 soldiers, a prison camp, and a McDonald's in Guantanamo. Now, the Philippines was brutally occupied until 1946, and to this day, Puerto Rico and Guam are unincorporated territories of the United States. For good measure, the US also annexed the islands of Hawaii in 1898. And so this brings us to the beginning of the 20th century, which again is what Lenin identified as the tipping point for full-fledged capitalist imperialism. So in 1904, President Teddy Roosevelt announced the Roosevelt Corollary as an update to the Monroe Doctrine. Not only were they against foreign intervention, European intervention in the Americas. Now he said that the US had not only the right, but the duty to intervene in the affairs of Latin America and the Caribbean, to defend US investments and infrastructure and political stability. And this was known as gunboat diplomacy. And it saw dozens of military interventions and occupations throughout the region. And as Roosevelt put it, speak softly and carry a big stick. And this was the epoch of the building of the Panama Canal and the so-called Banana Wars to defend the interests of the United Fruit Company. But it was the dollar diplomacy, as they called it, which followed, that really leveraged the economic power of US imperialism. Now, with World War I and the presidency of Woodrow Wilson, the US began to position itself as the world's dominant power, and its economy continued to grow very impressively. During what they called the Roaring Twenties, GDP grew by 42%, but this was followed by the Great Depression and the pre-revolutionary radicalization of the working class. Teddy Roosevelt's cousin, Franklin Roosevelt, successfully cut across that revolutionary mood by getting the US directly involved in the war with Japan and Germany. And it was World War II that really launched the US into the imperialist stratosphere. Here's a key fact. Over 16 million Americans served in the US military during World War II, but only 1 in 10 actually saw combat. This is how one writer put it. He said that the US military during World War II was first and foremost an unfathomable network of typists and file clerks. Secondarily, a stupendous mechanism for moving stuff from one part of the world to another. And last and least, a fighting organization. And through this network that it built up, by the end of the war, US imperialism had embedded itself everywhere, including into the very fabric of the formerly dominant European empires, including the British. Now remember, in the 1920s and 30s, Trotsky didn't rule out open war between the US and Britain, as the US rose and the British tried to defend what they had. In the end, this transition between the dominance of one imperialism and the other took place without a direct confrontation between the two. So at first, and I'll explain a little bit about how that happened. So at first, the U.S. was formally neutral in the war. The national mood was isolationist, and there was legislation that banned it from selling arms or offering credits to any of the warring nations. But in 1940, during the Blitz, they came up with the Destroyers for Bases Agreement. Destroyers, ships, naval ships. Yeah, and so which provided the UK with 50 naval destroyers, these battleships, for the low price of 99-year leases to set up American bases in British areas like Newfoundland, the Bahamas, Jamaica, where the US could fly its flag, confiscate property, build whatever it wanted, and its workers and soldiers were exempted from British taxes and laws. Then came the Lend-Lease program, which supplied the Allies, including the Russians, with $50 billion worth of food, oil, trucks, ships, planes, etc. So to paraphrase Marx, it was the almighty dollar, which was the heavy artillery used by U.S. imperialism to batter down all the Chinese walls. So during the 4 years that the U.S. was involved in the war, it set up 30,000 installations at over 2,000 bases worldwide. In Panama alone, it had 134 bases, not including the canal zone itself. Millions of troops were sent to Europe. They brought with them their food, their music, their sports. Over 2 million passed through Britain alone, including my grandfather, my great-uncle, and Alan Woods' father. And as the Brits used to say, there are only three things wrong with the Americans. They were overpaid, oversexed, and over here. And by the end of the war, Churchill grudgingly noted that the war had brought the U.S. to the summit of the world. In 1945, the U.S. produced more commodities, had more oil, more gold, more planes, more bases, more ships than pretty much all other countries combined. Not to mention a brief monopoly on atomic weapons. So American imperialism seemed poised to take direct possession of huge parts of the world. The overseas areas under U.S. jurisdiction included 135 million people, which is more than lived on the U.S. mainland. So its troops were everywhere. Its industrial base was intact. Its economy was in overdrive. And there was talk not only of making Alaska and Hawaii into states, but they even talked about making the Philippines a state, Iceland, possibly even France and Japan. It was like 1898 on steroids. But of course, several factors cut across this. First and foremost, the class struggle. Now, as the war wound down, the fires of revolution burned everywhere. Hundreds of millions of people rose up against colonial slavery. As one American general put it, Asia was an enormous pot, seething and boiling. Now, in 1940, nearly 1 in every 3 people living on the planet was directly colonized. By 1965, it was just 1 in 50 people. And I think that gives you an indication of the colossal power of the masses, even when their struggles were hijacked by reformists and Stalinists. But not only that, the US military was also infected with the spirit of rebellion. Millions had been mobilized to fight against fascism for freedom. And now that the war was over, they wanted to go home. They had no interest in fighting to establish new colonies or to hold old ones. It had taken them years to get the nearly 8 million troops that were stationed everywhere in their positions. And now not only did they need to get them all home, but they wanted to keep 2.5 million soldiers in uniform. According to the Army Chief of Staff, we are now concerned with the peace of the entire world, and the peace can only be maintained by the strong. But what resulted was the biggest mutiny in American military history. There were mass protests across Asia, Europe, and in the US. 20,000 American soldiers marched on Manila, saying the Filipinos are our allies. We ain't gonna fight them. In Guam, they burnt an effigy of the Secretary of War, an African-American unit stationed in Burma, an African-American unit of soldiers in Burma. They wrote the president and said they were disgusted with undemocratic American foreign policy. We do not want to unify China with bayonets and bombing plans. They were well aware that back home, they didn't even have the same rights as white Americans. And communists were actively involved in all of this agitation, which according to the authorities, had a destructive effect on soldiers and civilians' morale. So by June 1947, there was only a million US soldiers in uniform. And this all coincided with the biggest strike wave in US history. In 1945, there were nearly 5,000 work stoppages, followed by even more in 1946, involving 4.6 million workers. And wages were the main issue. After years of rationing and no strike clauses that were imposed by the Labor and Communist Party leaders, there were huge strikes in coal mining, railroads, steel. And so there was no way that the US imperialism could hold all these lands that they had. But that doesn't mean that they didn't plan on dominating the planet. During the war, they'd come to realize that they didn't need to physically occupy places to control them. With the logistical networks that they had built up, all they needed was a few hundred bases, some of them on remote islands, from which they could control the economic hubs of the global economy. And with their strong position in world banking, they could use all of this to dictate the terms of trade and the flows of currency and capital. The Bretton Woods system, established in 1944, basically made the U.S. the world's reserve currency. And although it fell apart in the 1970s, to this day, 37 countries and territories use the US dollar as their official currency. 1944 also saw the establishment of the IMF and the World Bank. They're also used to dominate. And then you had the Marshall Plan after the war, with the equivalent of 173 billion in modern dollars, sent to Western Europe to help rebuild after the war. And this was specifically aimed at countering the Soviet Union. And again, these were loans, not gifts. And the money had to be used to buy everything from US producers. Now, during the war, the US had been cut off from the tropics, the big parts of the world. And so they'd had to revolutionize many aspects of production in order to survive, basically. So again, with heavy state intervention, there was a massive push to standardize parts and compatibility across industries. There were huge advances in chemistry and synthetics, things like rubber, plastics, explosives, fertilizers, medicines, pesticides, and so on. And by 1946, the US accounted for 60% of world industrial production. And that was the objective basis that really drew the rest of the world into the gravitational pull of the US economy. But it deepened its grip on the world in other ways as well, from Hollywood and the music industry to a little thing called the internet and the adoption of English as the de facto lingua franca for the world. And let's not forget Coca-Cola, the black waters of imperialism, as many call it in Latin America, or black water as well. The private mercenary group that caused a little trouble in Afghanistan and Iraq, or even more importantly, BlackRock, which is the world's biggest investment management company. And as Lenin explained in Imperialism, financial institutions like this, they control huge parts of the economy well beyond their own market capitalization. It's like a giant pyramid of economic control. So BlackRock only has $113 billion in assets, but with that, it manages $10 trillion in assets around the world. But make no mistake about it, a physical and military presence remains a key part of US imperialism. It still has around 800 bases around the world, 3 times more than in any other country. It has 11 nuclear-powered aircraft carriers, which are like floating air bases that can go anywhere. And about 4 million people still live in US colonies, in Guam, Samoa, the Northern Marianas, and what they nicely call the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico. Now, Okinawa was returned to Japan in 1972, but 20% of the island is still a U.S. military base. 25% of Guam is a U.S. military base. And as an added bonus, big-name clothing companies, they operate sweatshops there using low-wage immigrant labor because everything made there is technically made in the USA. Same goes for Puerto Rico, which is also forced to host U.S. military facilities. And although the Philippines got independence in 1946, it was forced to grant several, military bases with 99-year leases. And with the rising tension in the South China Sea, they've actually increased the bases now from 5 to 9. So much for national sovereignty. All told, the U.S. has been involved in about 400 military interventions since 1776. And that doesn't even include the innumerable coups, assassinations, sanctions, sabotage, embargoes that it has orchestrated and imposed all around the world. But of course, nothing lasts forever. Everything eventually turns into its opposite. And I don't have time to go into it now, but the Vietnam War was a major turning point. The 1970s was a period of economic and social crisis. But after the fall of the Soviet Union, the US got a new lease on life. It went on an all-out offensive against the working class. It aggressively encroached on former Soviet territory. But its defeats in the so-called war on terror in Iraq and Afghanistan have again exposed it as a colossus with feet of clay. Now it's being humiliated in Ukraine, and its support for Israel is blown up in its face. And I think we'd agree that Russia's imperialist resurgence and the shifting balance of forces in the Middle East, those are significant developments. But the most important change in the last period has been the rise of China. For decades, it was seen by the imperialists as a source of cheap labor, as a giant maquiladora to assemble goods and undercut competitors while avoiding labor and environmental regulations. But as Lenin explained, the export of capital breeds capitalism in the countries where it's exported to. And we've explained how China used the bureaucratically deformed worker state and the core sectors of the planned economy as a springboard for the relatively cold restoration of capitalism and its development into a powerful imperialist country. China isn't making cheap plastic toys anymore. Well, they probably are, but they're doing a lot more than that too. I remember after World War II, the US accounted for 50% of GDP. And although China was the biggest country in population, it only accounted for 5% of GDP. Now there's different estimates, but today the US has fallen to about 26% of GDP and China has risen to 18%. So the US still has extremely high output per capita, but that's a significant fall in its global footprint, if you will. China is now number 2 when it comes to FDI, the biggest exporter of capital to Africa. And again, all of this is a huge change from the situation a couple of decades ago and illustrates, again, the objective basis for this relative US decline and the rise of China. You can see this in Fortune's list of the biggest global companies by revenue. In the top 10 today, you have 5 American companies, but also 3 Chinese, 1 Saudi, and 1 British Dutch. Of the 5 largest banks in the world ranked by market capitalization, 3 are American and 2 are Chinese. And if you rank the banks by their assets, the top 4 are all Chinese, and the 5th is Japanese. Now, that's not what the world looked like in 1945, and it's not what the world looked like in 2005. In fact, in 2005, the top 5 banks by assets were all European. Now, I think we all know that green energy, artificial intelligence, 5G, quantum computing, that's the future. And according to Foreign Affairs magazine, China wants to dominate new technologies, exploit US dependencies, and export its excess industrial capacity to put competitors out of business. Take electric vehicles as an example. There is this lame little company called BYD that Elon Musk just mocked not too long ago. But it's now overtaken Tesla as the world's biggest seller of electric vehicles. It surpassed Volkswagen as the top seller of cars within the world's biggest market, China. And its new hybrid cars cost half as much and drive twice as long as their next competitor, Toyota. So now it's the Chinese capitalists and their state who are battering down the walls with the export of commodities. And while the US just sent tens of billions of dollars to Israel and Ukraine, China just announced a $47.5 billion investment, not in weapons to someone else, but in the semiconductor industry, where it plans to be the leader by 2030. And of course, it has a slight interest in Taiwan, which currently makes 90% of those advanced chips. Or take an old school industry like shipping. In 1975, the US was ranked number 1 in global capacity. Now the US is in 19th place. And last year, China produced more than 1,000 ocean-going vessels, while the US produced 10. This has big implications beyond commercial shipping, because more than 90% of military equipment travels by sea, mostly on privately contracted commercial cargo vessels. So all countries, and especially the main imperialist countries, they want to export not only capital, but also crisis, class struggle, unemployment, and discontent. And Biden is under pressure not to lose more American manufacturing jobs. This is a key political question. About 2 million jobs were lost in the early 2000s to what they call the China shock. And now you have a situation where millions of American workers in the Rust Belt are angry at the Democrats, and they think the Republicans are a working class party. And this is a clear example of how the national and the international, the the economic and the political are all interconnected. And you can't disconnect economies or the social contradictions that flow from the contradictions of capitalism. So Biden has actually intensified Trump's America First protectionist measures, striking blows against not only China, but also Europe. And so with China's economy slowing down, the entire world is in this desperate struggle to get as much as possible out of the world while avoiding the contradictions and explosions of their own class struggle. So they have to kind of dance around each other, maneuvering for an advantage as both collaborators and rivals. This is clearly the case with the US and China in the Pacific, for example, but it's not always clear where the red lines lie that could lead to open conflict. As it happens, China now has the world's largest active duty military, over 2 million troops. They have sophisticated weaponry and have already launched one nuclear aircraft carrier. The Chinese Navy has more ships than the US Navy, and they're mostly concentrated in the Pacific while the US fleet is spread out all over the world. And while it only has one official military base abroad in Djibouti, it's actively seeking access elsewhere, including places like Cuba. So they've taken a page out of the playbook of US imperialism after World War II, and they now operate ports and terminals at over 100 locations in 50 different countries in what they call the Maritime Silk Road as part of their Belt and Road Initiative. It's even made huge inroads into America's backyard of Latin America. A couple of years ago, the former head of the US Southern Command said, "We are losing our positional advantage in the Western Hemisphere, and immediate action is needed to reverse this trend." And the US itself has been targeted, not just through Huawei or TikTok, but it's China's shipping conglomerate, Costco, operates terminals at some of the biggest, most important US ports like Los Angeles. Now, to deal with this, the US has been trying to pivot to Asia to get out of the Middle East and Europe, but it keeps getting sucked into those regions. And it's because it's not so easy to be the world's policeman in an epoch of decline and crisis and revolution. Now, for several decades, US military doctrine was based on what they called the two-war construct, which basically said that they should have enough forces to fight two major wars in two different parts of the planet. But by the early 2010s, they had to acknowledge that one major war is all they can handle. And even then, you've seen how what they've done to avoid getting stuck into a direct confrontation with Russia, which they might not be able to win. As a top U.S. senator recently said, America's military is not prepared for war or peace. I mean, just look what happened in Afghanistan. After spending $2.3 trillion and sending as many as 100,000 troops at a time in the longest war U.S. imperialism has ever been involved in, after they claimed they learned the lessons of Vietnam, they had a humiliating withdrawal and everything collapsed overnight. Or look at countries like Turkey or Israel or even Saudi Arabia. All these little gangsters trying to get away with as much as they can because the Godfather is distracted elsewhere. It's also a question of confidence. After Ukraine, can Taiwan or the Philippines or Indonesia or even Japan or Australia be sure that the US will defend them militarily if things heat up with China? So while the US is still clearly the dominant power on the planet as a whole, it's not necessarily dominant in every particular part of the planet. Now, another part of China's strategy is the BRICS, which now accounts for 30% of world GDP and 45% of the world population. They've even talked about creating a BRICS currency for trade between the BRICS countries. And according to Foreign Policy magazine, de-dollarization's moment might finally be here. Now, an aging, wounded lion can be just as dangerous as a young and healthy one. And let's not forget that China's leaders are sitting on the dynamite of the world's largest working class. American workers are beginning to move into action. And there's a serious crisis in military recruitment. Only 9% of Americans aged 16 to 21 say they would even consider joining the military. So we can expect very turbulent times ahead. The CIA is worried. The director recently said, China's rise and Russia's revanchism pose daunting geopolitical challenges in a world of intense strategic competition in which the United States no longer enjoys uncontested primacy and in which existential climate threats are mounting. That's a pretty bleak outlook. So needless to say, US imperialism is in uncharted waters. And if Trump wins again, all bets are off, even for key institutions like NATO. Remember what Trump said immediately after the invasion of Ukraine. He said, "This is genius. Oh, that's wonderful. You got to say that's pretty savvy. Putin's a genius for invading Ukraine." And he has said that if NATO members don't pay their fair share, he'll encourage the Russians to do whatever the hell they want to them. So the nation state and the market economy based on private ownership of the means of production are the main barriers to human progress. Imperialism tries to overcome this by extending its power and influence beyond its national borders through the export of capital and military force. But like the expansion of the market through credit, this can only go so far. And no country or politician can square the circle of the organic contradictions of capitalism indefinitely. So Trump's economic nationalism is really just the recognition that capitalist globalization has reached its limits and that it's every imperialist for himself. So, comrades, this is a huge topic. There's a lot more that could be said, for example, about Gaza or Ukraine, about the militarization of the US-Mexico border, or about the concentration of international capital and how it flows. But suffice it to say that everything is in flux. There are no permanent imperial powers. There are no permanent modes of production. And since foreign policy and domestic policy are so connected, what happens abroad and at home all has a huge effect on mass consciousness. With all the chaos in the world, a recent poll found that Americans, that 40% of American voters want to be isolationists. Only 17% want active engagement with the world. And only 38% of Americans say that they are extremely proud to be American, which is very different from how it was for nearly a century. There was this idea of American exceptionalism, the American dream. And issues like Ukraine and Gaza are live issues in American politics in an election year. Whether it's Biden or Trump, millions of Americans now see evil, only evil, not greater or lesser evil. The all-important question of climate change is also connected to the fight against imperialism, because the US military is the number one polluter in the world. It emits more than 50 metric tons of CO2 every year. So if you want to stop climate change or reverse this trend, you need to stop the imperialist war machine. And to do that, you need to overthrow capitalism. Now, as revolutionary communists, we're internationalists, of course. We take an interest in events worldwide. We offer solidarity to the workers in every struggle. But as has been emphasized this week, we should never lose sight of the fact that the main enemy is at home. That's how we stop the war in Gaza. By building an organization strong enough to bring down our imperialist governments and take over the economy. In the case of the US, 69% of Israel's arms come from the US, all of it authorized by Congress and the president. And as we've explained in recent articles, mass action of the working class can not only paralyze the economy, but establish a workers' state. And again, the fight is mainly economic, not military. I think sometimes it's hard to wrap your head around just how vast the concentration of capital is. There's millions of companies in the United States, but just 500 of them are worth $34 trillion, and they account for 66% of GDP. So by expropriating just 500 companies, an American workers' government would already hold the key levers of the economy in its hands. So in the contest between imperialism and the working class, it's not just about the number of tanks and soldiers in uniform. It's about the class balance of forces, about working class consciousness, confidence, unity, and leadership. But even in the military, soldiers in uniform workers in uniform and soldiers in uniform are affected by the generalized crisis and radicalization. We see mutinies and splits along class lines in the military in every single revolution. And the reality is that the capitalists don't have enough carrots or enough sticks to keep all of us in line all of the time. I mean, they can't even, they don't even have enough ammunition for the Ukrainians, Israelis, and themselves. And we know that revolutionary explosions of the class struggle are on the agenda. And if we succeed in building a revolutionary leadership in the next historical period, one country after another will fall to the socialist revolution like dominoes. The communists in power will dramatically transform human relations, which will be based on genuine cooperation and solidarity between all peoples. These bloated military budgets would go instead for schools and healthcare. All the artificial borders that divide us would be abolished. And the rational planning of the economy on a world scale would allow an incredible quality of life for everybody. So comrades, future generations, they'll get to discuss not the history of the rise and relative decline of US imperialism, but the history of the rise and fall of all imperialism. And the comrades of the RCI will have played a role in making that history. So to paraphrase the Romans, if you want peace, prepare for war, for class war. Long live the fight against imperialism. No about war but the class war, comrades.
If you are a communist and you're not organized, you need to get organized with the Revolutionary Communists of America, part of the newly founded Revolutionary Communist International. There's a link in the description to join us now. Watch the other sessions from this world event and prepare for the fight we have in front of us against imperialism and the overthrow of capitalism.